Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this new edition of the BRICSonomics show on the Thick Bricks channel. My name is Ben Epstein, and I am thrilled that you guys are going to be joining us today. Uh, Apologize for us being late on this time. We are dealing with some technical difficulties on our side, so please be sure to put in the comments section that you guys can hear me okay, that there isn't any issues with the audio or anything like that. And I'll be watching out in the comments and everything like that just as we go through this discussion today. And it's a very interesting one. We're coming really in the wake of the 39th African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, which is in Ethiopia, which is a core or a new member of BRICS. So today we're going to go through the recent African Union Summit meeting, what their plans are, as well as how Agenda 2063 will be molding the shape of Africa in the time to come, and how both Ethiopia as a nation, but also how it could collaborate with BRICS to revolutionize and progress a lot of these flagship projects under Agenda 2063. So back to this recent summit in Addis Ababa, because we really have seen a shaking of the development finance framework kind of beneath our feet right now. For decades, Africa was a passive recipient of these global decisions. And today, it is really becoming a co author of a brand new multipolar global order. And the real big headline from this is the African Union has just put a $170 billion annual price tag on the continent's infrastructure needs. And for 2026, they've chosen a theme that sort of reframes the very concept of growth. And it's known as the Assuring Sustainable Water Availability and Safe Sanitation Systems, which is obviously making sure that there is clean water. And if you don't think that if you think that water is just a social service, then you're missing the macro picture of why this matters so much for Ethiopia and Africa. The African Union is now calling water economic infrastructure. One reason is because water related diseases cost Africa 115 deaths every single hour. And that's a massive drain, not just obviously on human life, but also on the labor productivity and the human capital potential that that African and African youth are going to be providing in the coming decades. Bear in mind, Africa will have the biggest population by continent by 2040. So how Africa is going to be reshaping this, they need to address water as a essential sustainable need. So at the summit, the African Investment Program unveiled a $32 billion pipeline of over 80 investment ready projects that will be between hydropower, but also to climate resilient irrigation. And this is going to be a new substrate for the agenda for 2063. So let's see here if I can find the right slides, guys. I'm always bad at these slides. I'll have them actually organized the right way. So anyway, let's talk about Ethiopia's economic edge in this. So Ethiopia's GDP growth has climbed to 9.3%. And when you compare this to other African nations, it has far surpassed a lot of these nations that are hitting an approximate about 4% annual growth average. Even between 1995 to 2015 to now, Ethiopia has had astounding GDP growth rate, especially when we compare it to other African nations, sort of in an average approximate scenario. So now the AU summit, as I mentioned, was in Addis Ababa, which is a main Ethiopian city. So Ethiopia really is sort of the perfect case study for the transition that not just they will be facing, but also African nations will be dealing with as they continue to revolutionize their own infrastructure and programs. But this 9.3% growth is sort of on this razor's edge. In December of 2023, it became the third African nation to default on a Eurobond. But if we look at the potential problems with, fiscal solvency, for example, they are really leaning into mega energy investment projects to help deal with that issue. So, what do I mean about this sort of energy diplomacy that they're trying to do here? What has Ethiopia done to sort of mold this? So, Ethiopia has transformed into this powerhouse of the Horn of Africa for two very important reasons. The first is the construction of their Grand Ethiopian Resistance Dam, which, if you guys are not aware, the dam now is supplying about a third of, not only does it supply a third of Ethiopia's electricity, but it's also exporting this electricity to countries like Kenya, Djibouti, and Tanzania, and it's generated $118 million in revenue in 2024 to the 2025 fiscal year alone. So this is going to be a very reliable, export for Ethiopia. But this project in particular is something that they can use for the Agenda 2063 flagship projects moving forward. But interestingly, if we sort of connect exports per capita, now the energy exports is a great standout, but exports per capita in Ethiopia is actually very, very low. One of the lowest in the African continent in general. If countries like Egypt have about a $446 export per capita, or Tanzania would be around $120 export per capita, Ethiopia is only at $30 of exports per capita. So, ever since Ethiopia has pivoted away from this Western-led shock theory and Agoya suspensions towards a model that is based on this economic integration and cooperation with other countries like China, and BRICS in general. I don't want to just call one country out because it really is their interaction with BRICS in general that is making their economy that much more robust, but also able to export electricity out to neighboring countries, something that they can really use for these projects that we're going to be discussing in just a second. So I talked about the Agenda 2063. So Agenda 2063 right now, it is sort of the project that is going to transform Africa into the 21st century. And they have a list of flagship projects, about 9 or so, that is designed to revolutionize their infrastructure, people-to-people migration, so we could talk, for example, one program that has been the most successful is the African Continental Free Trade Area. So this is a unified market of over 1.4 billion people with GDP worth about $3.4 trillion dollars. So even though and right now, so Ethiopia is already exporting leather products, meat, agricultural products like animals and things of that nature to their neighbors under these protocols. So the AF, the AfCFTA, I don't know why I tried to acronym that. The African Continental Free Trade Area. It's so much better that I don't have to do the acronym like that. That has been the most successful project under 2063. But within that, there are a lot of projects that are facing delays, such as the high speed rail corridor that is designed to unify a lot of these African countries through rail. But because of other needs by African nations, it has not been, a priority to get that moving. Or, for example, they have the Grand Inga Dam, which is designed to provide over 43,000 megawatts of electricity. And to understand that scale, that would be able to provide electricity for at least not just Ethiopia and its neighbors, but arguably the complete Central African nations within that area. So, at creating this dam to get access to affordable electricity is a monumental project, but because of a lot of issues that other nations are facing at this moment, they, they're finding it hard to sort of get their feet off the ground in that way. The bottleneck for this is always financing. And when we talk about the traditional aid, is also declining in this area, not just from the United States, but also, the European Union and other nations within the sort of Western centric hemisphere who isn't providing as much foreign direct investment or any traditional or as much traditional aid. The African Union has recognized that they have to mobilize over $3 trillion in additional funding over the next decade to hit these targets, and these targets relating to these flagship projects, but also providing, like we were talking about before, access for clean and safe drinking water for their citizens. Now, where can Ethiopia really shine in these projects, and where can BRICS themselves really shine in these projects? Let me just take a sip of water, and we're going to go through the Ethiopia portion first. And then if you guys have any questions or anything like that, we can talk, we'll expand more into the BRICS one too. Hello, Leroy Essel. Ocean water is ideal for producing highly competitive hydrogen because harvesting magnesium, chemicals, and sodium ions and CO2 credits. It's very interesting. You may be right, Leroy, about that. A lot of my research I've seen is it's very, very hard to get ocean from like energy from tidal waves and things like that. It's kind of messy, but I don't know enough about that to say that. But to say that definitively, but it's definitely an area where Ethiopia can really thrive is utilizing that hydroelectric power like they are already doing. Okay, so okay, so let's go back to Ethiopia and Ethiopia's role for Agenda 2063 and these projects. So I think when we talk about uh, Ethiopia so far, we've highlighted that their the GR or GERD, that dam has provided a lot of affordable energy for themselves, but also for their neighbors. So one area that Ethiopia could really benefit, not just themselves, but also in Agenda 2063, would be with that massive dam that is going to be under construction, which is the Grand Inga Dam, like we've talked about. Now, when I say take the lead, I don't simply mean come up with all of the financing, completely initiate it end to end and complete the project. Obviously, that's not going to be in their capacity. But what is in their capacity is the expertise that this dam has provided them. And the idea that they've been able to provide over a third of their electricity because of this dam shows that they need to be a cornerstone, and they should be a cornerstone for this project. Now, another idea that truly I've not given enough breath to is the idea of this single African air transport market. Now, we're going to call it SAATM. That's the sort of anagram. But where this is sort of designed to be, if the African Free Continental Trade Area is this big single unified market where there isn't any trade barriers, this air transport market is designed to make sure these markets and are interconnected in a way that is emphasized by rail, obviously transporting goods that way, but allowing this air transport market adds a completely new dimension to transporting goods. Because what we need to understand too is a lot of these countries are agro-intensive economies right now, so there isn't a lot of while rail is probably way more essential right now for them to establish, there will come a point where they'll need to have an air transport market once their economies are leaning more into manufacturing or simply need to transport the animals safely and effectively through air. Now, Ethiopia, where does Ethiopia fit into all of this? Well, Ethiopia has really taken the initiative and has been constructing the biggest highway in Africa. And we actually did a video, Anastasia covered it weeks ago, that I really want you guys to check out to get a better understanding on the construction of that airport and sort of the effect that it's going to have. The way that Ethiopia is trying to become the nexus of trade through air in this case, but also trying to lead an initiative on infrastructure projects with their expertise in, energy and, dams and those sort of intensive projects. This will, sorry, I lost my train of thought. But what I'm trying to say is that the air market, Ethiopia's construction of the biggest airport in Africa, will allow them similarly to give their expertise and guidance on constructing this massive air transport network. The same way that Ethiopia's airport is designed to integrate all of these trade networks and become the hub of this, intra-African trade, they can do that with this air market to unify all of the states in Africa in one clean, solid network. Now, those are the two main areas where Ethiopia can sort of really lend its expertise. Now, another idea that was sort of, it's considered, is the revolution that Ethiopia's had in sort of financial technology and digital payment systems, as one of the projects under Agenda 2063 is related to cybersecurity and develop not just cybersecurity for things from a legal perspective, but also from an educational perspective, as they want to establish virtual universities so people can get better access to education. Now, for Ethiopia, they've debuted a brand new digital payment system that we've talked about in our BRICS Pay live streams in the previous episode. But the idea that they are using this digital payment system and it's completely revolutionized the way that they're doing transactions in that country, where over 95% of transactions are now done virtually. Ethiopia has an opportunity to sort of apply that and, sort of scale up this sort of digital service for a lot of these African nations because this will actually reduce a lot of the transaction costs. And a lot of what is talked about with de-dollarization and going away from the dollar is the SWIFT system is incredibly inefficient and incredibly costly in comparison. It's estimated that they could, cut over $5 billion annually, specifically just from transaction fees, if they lean into something that is not SWIFT, that doesn't rely on the dollar. So I would say that important infrastructure such as energy, the air sort of transport network, and potentially also in digital and fintech services. I would say those are the three sectors that Ethiopia's industries are that competitive and have that much expertise that I think that they should be leading this initiative for the African Union. Now, there are a lot of projects with that in mind that um, they quite frankly should, do what they can and collaborate with other BRICS countries, but also with the New Development Bank for financing. And when we kind of look back and we sort of talk about like the New Development Bank here, like the New Development Bank has been quietly rewriting the rules in investment related finance ever since it's really been founded. And, you know, with Ethiopia becoming the fourth African member of the New Development Bank, there's a lot of ways that they can really push funding this $170 billion infrastructure gap, mind you, that they need to meet every year. So one way is sort of this no conditionality lending, where the NDB, because they've long focused on climate resilient and also infrastructure projects, they would focus on the project's bankability and not about political shock therapy, like a lot of Western, analysts did try to, recommend, in the 80s and the 90s, and we saw how well that turned out. The second way the NDB can help is through the project preparation fund. And this is going to provide like the technical grants that will turn these concepts that they'll have into these bankable projects. So not only will they have capital from the NDB, but providing these technical grants will also give them access to private capital. And the third is obviously the local currency settlement. And like we talked about, this is a massive problem. And for, the NDB in this context is already aimed to extend 30% of its financing in local currencies by 2026. And as we've discussed, you know, when countries are facing this sort of dollar trap or sort of the gravity that the dollar has, and it forces African nations to pay essentially like a 300 basis point risk premium just for where they live, you know, that is why they need to do everything they can to push this local currency settlement. And also the guarantee model. Now, what is the guarantee model? There is a model that BRICS, like it would draw on this sort of NIGA model, and it's designed to reduce the political and the financial, political and financial risks that would potentially scare off any sort of private investors because they'll have a safe rate of return. And with a lot of these projects, mind you, there are investors that will be looking for sort of an immediate return. But when you have this much scalability, or not just scalability, but also these guarantees in this way, these safeguards, the investors will feel way more comfortable for the amount of time the projects will take to develop. So there are a lot of areas that BRICS can help out and BRICS nations can help out on this project. You know, we can look to we can look to China with their investment in high-speed rail and how the Belt and Road Initiative could help with their high-speed rail project. We could talk about how India's revolution in this green energy technology can help scale up a lot of the manufacturing and the infrastructure needed to provide safe and reliable energy that is not dependent on fossil fuels if they are so dependent on such. You know, it could also be also cooperating with Brazil to make sure that these projects also bear in mind that keep the sustainability part front and focused and making sure that the projects also are united under a vision of African unity and sovereignty. So there's a lot of areas that not just Ethiopia can really contribute to these projects, but BRICS nations can too. And when you see the amount of money that's going to be needed and the partnerships that you can form, if I'm an analyst, I'm interested and I'm definitely jumping on this. Okay. So let's finally pull all of this together and really look at the plumbing of how this multipolar order is going to, is really transforming right now. For one thing, we're really seeing the rise of the Pan African payment and settlement system. And like we were talking about before, this allows nations to trade with tech in local currencies. But oh man, I don't have that slide in there. Of course, I don't. But the Pan African payment and settlement system will allow them to trade in local currencies, and within this system, it can eliminate $5 billion in transaction fees annually just from using this system away from the SWIFT system they've used. Like, that's how important this is. And if you combine that with, logistics corridors like the $1.55 billion Djibouti Ethiopia pipeline, and you see a strategy that is not just physical, but also building on financial sovereignty, simultaneously. This sort of infrastructure statecraft that the African Union is really pushing will has an opportunity for integration with BRICS and Ethiopia because they're signaling that there are other options on the table for developing these projects. And also, there are more and other options for financing. 2026 is not 1946, Africa is no longer just a site for resource extraction. These flagship projects that the African Union is really pushing will transform them to become the center of a high value renewable energy and digitally transformed economy that ideally will be able to link themselves seamlessly in terms of trade, in terms of migration and things like that, in an area where they could finally really govern the way without external interference. And I think that BRICS can really help push that forward. So that's going to be the end of today's presentation. I hope you guys found this really interesting. I found this really interesting because we don't talk enough about Ethiopia, but also about the African Union and seeing how they are really putting these initiatives together to transform their society and also their continent is something that I think we really need to keep an eye on moving forward. But until next time, guys, thank you all so much for watching. Please be sure to hit like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you again all very soon.